Sometimes the coldest nights reveal the warmest hearts. Sometimes a stranger's kindness is all that stands between life and death. In the winter of 1882, mountain man Samuel Frost found 4 women abandoned in a Wyoming blizzard, a pregnant widow and her 3 younger sisters, hours from freezing to death. He brought them to his cabin, gave them warmth and safety, and asked for nothing in return. But the widow was hiding something. Within days, Samuel discovered she carried a secret that powerful men would kill for a fortune she never knew existed. Those men were already coming, tracking her across 3 territories through the deadly cold. They wouldn't stop until they found what she'd hidden. What could be worth hunting a pregnant woman through a killing winter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Frost had chosen this life deliberately. After 12 years in the cavalry and 3 more drifting between towns that all looked the same, he'd found this cabin tucked into a fold of the Wind River Range, where the Wyoming territory stretched empty and white for miles in every direction. Here, at nearly 8,000 feet, the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. The wind spoke in a language older than words, and the mountains kept their secrets well. He was 42 years old, though the mirror, when he bothered to look, showed a man who could pass for 50. His hair had gone grey at the temples, his face weathered to leather by altitude and exposure. His hands were scarred from 1,000 small violences, rope burns, knife slips, the teeth of traps, the kick of rifles. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and strong in the way of men who live by their bodies rather than their wits, though Samuel possessed both in equal measure. The cabin itself was modest, 1 room 20 feet square, with a stone fireplace he'd built himself from river rock, a sleeping platform in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs near the fire, shelves lined with supplies that had to last through winters that could stretch 6 months. Traps and tools hung from pegs on the walls. 3 rifles stood in the corner, his father's old Henry repeater, a newer Winchester, and a shotgun for close work. He kept them clean and oiled, though he hadn't fired a shot in anger since the war ended. He trapped for pelts in winter, panned for gold in summer, and lived on venison, trout, and whatever supplies he could pack in from the trading post at South Pass, 40 miles distant. It was enough. More than enough, really, because Samuel Frost had learned that a man doesn't need much when he's left everything that mattered behind. The storm had come down from the north 3 days ago, the kind of blizzard that could bury a standing horse. Samuel had secured his cabin, laid in extra wood, and settled in to wait it out. He'd weathered worse. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, and the snow came down so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Temperature dropped to maybe 20 below, cold enough that your breath froze in your beard, cold enough to kill an unprepared man in an hour. On the 3rd day, when the wind finally began to ease, Samuel strapped on his snowshoes and went to check his trapline. The sky was that peculiar pale grey that comes after a big storm, and the world lay buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. His breath steamed in the air. Each step broke through the crust with a soft crunch that echoed in the stillness. He was 2 miles from the cabin, near the creek where he'd set snares for rabbit, when he saw the tracks. Not animal tracks, human. Boot prints, several sets, staggering and irregular. They came from the east, from the direction of the old mining trail that led eventually to the town of Prescott, 30 miles away. No one should have been out in that storm. No one with any sense. Samuel followed the tracks with growing unease. They wandered, crossing back on themselves, the kind of trail left by people who were lost or dying, or both. He found the first sign of blood, a quarter-mile later, drops frozen black against the white snow. Then scraps of cloth caught on brush. A woman's shawl, he realized, holding the torn fabric in his gloved hand. He moved faster, reading the signs. 4 people, he thought. Maybe 5. Getting weaker with each step. The tracks led toward a stand of pine where the snow had drifted deep against a fallen log. That's where he found them. 4 women, huddled together for warmth that wasn't enough, half buried in snow that had drifted over them during the night. For a moment, Samuel thought he was too late, that he'd found 4 corpses frozen in their final embrace. Then one of them moved, the smallest one, barely more than a girl, and made a sound like a wounded animal. He was on his knees in an instant, brushing away snow, checking for signs of life. 3 of them were conscious, barely. The 4th, a woman in her 20s, dark-haired and heavily pregnant, was unconscious, her lips blue, her skin like ice. Frostbite had blackened her fingers where they clutched a leather journal against her chest. "Help us," one of the younger women whispered. She had auburn hair and green eyes that held more determination than fear. "Please. My sister, she's pregnant. She's dying." Samuel didn't waste time with questions. He'd seen men die of exposure in the war. Had maybe an hour, 2 at most, to get them warm, or they'd be past saving. He was strong, but he couldn't carry 4 grown women 2 miles through deep snow. He'd have to make 2 trips. "Can any of you walk?" he asked. The auburn-haired woman nodded. "I can. Sarah can too, maybe." She shook the girl next to her, a blonde with a gentle face. "Sarah, wake up. We have to move." The 3rd sister, younger, maybe 16, with dark hair like the pregnant one, just stared at Samuel with eyes that held nothing but terror. She was in shock, he realized. Wouldn't be any help. He made his decision quickly. "I'm taking your pregnant sister and the young one first. You 2 follow my tracks. Stay together. Keep moving. It's 2 miles due west. You stop, you die. Understand?" The auburn-haired woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You'll come back for us?" He met her eyes. "I give you my word." He wrapped the pregnant woman in his coat, lifted her as gently as he could, and started back toward the cabin. She weighed almost nothing, or maybe the adrenaline made her light. The terrified girl followed, stumbling through the broken trail he'd made. He talked to her as they walked, keeping her focused, keeping her moving. "What's your name?" No answer. "My name's Samuel, Samuel Frost. You're going to be all right, all of you. Just keep walking." Still nothing, but she kept moving, and that was enough. The cabin appeared through the trees like salvation. He kicked open the door, carried the pregnant woman to his bed, piled every blanket he owned over her, built up the fire until the heat was almost unbearable, warmed water and tried to get some down her throat. Her pulse was thready, her breathing shallow. He'd seen men in better shape die. The young girl collapsed by the fire, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He wrapped her in his bearskin, put warm stones from the hearth near her feet. Then he went back out into the cold. He found the other 2 sisters a mile from the cabin, still walking, supporting each other. The auburn-haired one had her arm around the blonde, half carrying her. They were tough, these women, tougher than they looked. He got them to the cabin, settled them near the fire, made them drink warm broth from the venison stew he'd had simmering. Slowly, color began to return to their faces. The blonde, Sarah, the auburn-haired one had called her, started to cry. Quiet tears of relief and exhaustion. The auburn-haired woman never cried. She sat close to the pregnant woman, holding her hand, whispering to her, "You're safe now, Catherine. We're safe. Just hold on, Catherine." The pregnant woman had a name now. They all did, Samuel supposed, though he hadn't asked yet. There would be time for questions later, after he'd made sure they weren't going to die in his cabin. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening, treating frostbite, warming them gradually, making sure they stayed hydrated. The young, dark-haired girl never spoke, just stared at him with those haunted eyes. The blonde, Sarah, drifted in and out of sleep. The auburn-haired woman, clearly the one in charge, stayed alert, watching him, watching her sisters, missing nothing. It was near midnight when Catherine's fever spiked. She started thrashing, muttering in delirium. Samuel tried to cool her down, but she fought him with surprising strength for someone half-frozen hours before. "They can't find it," she whispered, her eyes wide but unseeing. Thomas knew. Thomas hid it. They'll kill us all if they find it. Hush now, Samuel said. But she grabbed his wrist with fingers that felt like burning coals. Promise me, she said, suddenly lucid, her eyes focusing on his face. Promise me you'll protect my sisters. Promise me. I promise, Samuel heard himself say, though he had no idea what he was promising or why. She released him then, fell back against the pillow, her fever raging. The auburn-haired woman looked at Samuel across the bed, and in her eyes he saw the same question he was asking himself. What had he just gotten himself into? Outside, the wind had picked up again. Fresh snow began to fall, and somewhere in the distance, too faint to be certain, Samuel thought he heard the sound of horses moving through the night. The storm, it seemed, was far from over. The fever broke on the third morning. Samuel woke to find Catherine sitting up in bed, pale and weak but lucid. Her dark eyes followed him as he moved around the cabin, stoking the fire, preparing coffee. The other three sisters were still asleep, Margaret curled in a blanket near the hearth, Sarah and Elizabeth sharing the bearskin on the floor. "Thank you," Catherine said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from days of delirium. "For saving us. For taking us in." Samuel poured her a cup of water, helped her drink. "You gave us quite a scare. That was a high fever. How long have we been here?" 3 days since I found you. Storm finally broke yesterday." He studied her face, saw the intelligence behind the exhaustion. "You're lucky to be alive. All of you. What were you doing out on that trail in a blizzard?" Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly, then to the leather journal that lay on the table beside the bed. Samuel had moved it there while treating her, had noticed how she'd clutched it, even in unconsciousness, as if it were more precious than life itself. "We were running," she said simply. "From what?" She looked at her sisters, still sleeping, then back at Samuel. "From men who want something my husband had, something they think I have now." Margaret stirred then, sat up quickly when she saw Catherine awake. "Thank God," she breathed, moving to her sister's side. "We thought we'd lost you." "I'm all right, Maggie, thanks to Mr. Frost." "Samuel," he corrected. "If we're sharing a cabin, might as well use first names." Over the next hour, as the sun climbed and the others woke, the story came out in pieces. Margaret did most of the talking, with Catherine adding details when her strength allowed. Sarah sat close, holding Catherine's hand. Elizabeth remained apart, watching Samuel with those haunted eyes, never speaking. Catherine's husband was Thomas Ward, a surveyor and geologist by trade. They'd lived in Prescott, a mining town 3 days' ride east. Thomas worked for various mining companies, mapping territories, assessing mineral deposits. He was good at his work, careful, thorough, honest, maybe too honest. 6 months ago, Thomas had been hired by the Consolidated Mining Company to survey what they thought was empty land north of Prescott. He'd been gone for 3 weeks. When he came back, Catherine said, he was different, excited but also frightened. He told her he'd found something extraordinary, something that would change their lives forever. He said they'd never want for anything again. 2 weeks later, Thomas was dead. The official story was a mining accident, a cave-in at one of the old surveys he was inspecting. They brought his body back in a closed coffin, too damaged, they said, to be viewed. Catherine had buried her husband without ever seeing his face one last time. "But you didn't believe it was an accident," Samuel said. Catherine shook her head. Thomas was careful. He'd worked in mines for 15 years and never had so much as a close call. And there was no reason for him to be in that particular mine. It had been abandoned for 5 years. There were no other witnesses, Margaret added. The foreman who reported the accident quit the company the next day and left town. No one ever saw him again. For a month after the funeral, nothing happened. Catherine grieved, tried to put her life back together, discovered she was pregnant. Her 3 younger sisters, orphaned years before and living with Catherine and Thomas, helped her through the darkest days. Then the men started coming. First it was subtle. Men asking questions around town. Had Thomas left any papers, any maps or surveys? Did Catherine have his work journals? They were from the mining company, they said. Just tying up loose ends, making sure all the official documents were accounted for. Catherine told them she'd burned Thomas's papers. It seemed like what a grieving widow would do, and besides, she had burned most of them. The technical surveys meant nothing to her, just pages of numbers and geological terms she couldn't understand. But she'd kept one thing, the leather journal Thomas had pressed into her hands the night before he died, telling her it was important, telling her to keep it safe no matter what. The questions became more aggressive. Men came to her house, searched it without permission. Her neighbors were questioned, intimidated. Someone broke into the small office where Thomas had kept his surveying equipment. They took everything, his instruments, his reference books, his files. That's when we knew we had to leave, Margaret said. When they threatened Sarah. Sarah's gentle face hardened at the memory. A man followed me from the market, told me it would be a shame if something happened to Catherine or the baby. Said we should cooperate, tell them what they wanted to know. We left that night, Catherine continued, took what we could carry and ran. We'd been on the road for 3 weeks when the storm caught us. We thought we'd lost them, but... She paused, her hand trembling as she reached for the journal. They found us again, 2 days before the storm. We saw riders on our trail, so we left the road, tried to lose them in the mountains. That's when the blizzard hit. Samuel looked at the journal. Plain brown leather, about the size of a man's hand, worn at the edges. And that's what they want? What's in there? I don't know, Catherine admitted. I've looked at it 100 times. It's all Thomas's notes and drawings, survey markers, geological samples, calculations. There are maps, but they don't show towns or trails, just coordinates and terrain features. I can't make sense of any of it. May I? Samuel asked. Catherine hesitated, then nodded. Margaret looked uncertain, but she didn't object. Samuel opened the journal carefully. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, technical notations, hand-drawn maps. He recognized some of it. His father had been a surveyor before the war, had taught Samuel the basics. These were professional survey notes, precisely detailed. He flipped through the pages slowly. Geological assessments, elevation markers, soil samples. Then he stopped, his finger tracing a notation in the margin. A reference to something called Fortune's Ridge, with coordinates and a cryptic note. Vein extends 400 yards NE. Estimate 20-30 ounces per ton. Filed under CM. Samuel had spent 12 years in these mountains. He knew Fortune's Ridge, a remote area about 30 miles north, all granite cliffs and deep valleys. He'd trapped there, knew it was empty country with no settlements, no active mines. If Thomas had found a gold deposit there, and if it assayed at 20 to 30 ounces per ton, it would be worth a fortune. Maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. He turned more pages, found a document folded and tucked into the back of the journal, a land claim form, partially filled out. Filed under the name Catherine Morgan, Catherine's maiden name. Samuel looked up at Catherine, saw that she was watching him with desperate hope. You can read it? You understand what it means? Some of it, he said carefully. Your husband was a surveyor. These are his field notes from a job he did last year. He decided not to mention the gold, not yet, not until he was certain. The men looking for you, did they say who they worked for? The Consolidated Mining Company, Margaret said. At least, that's what they claimed at first. Later, they stopped pretending. They just wanted the journal. The Consolidated Mining Company. Samuel had heard of them, one of the bigger operations in the territory, owned by a man named Dalton Briggs. Ruthless, people said. The kind of man who didn't let obstacles stand in his way. If Thomas had found a valuable deposit while working for Briggs, and if he'd filed the claim under his wife's name instead of the company's, that would explain everything. Briggs would want those survey notes, would need them to file his own claim or to contest Catherine's ownership, and he'd be willing to do whatever it took to get them. These men, Samuel said slowly, they won't stop looking for you. "I know," Catherine whispered, "and you can't run forever. Not with a baby coming, not in winter." "I know that too," she met his eyes. "That's why I asked you to promise. In my fever, I remember asking you to protect my sisters. Do you remember?" Samuel nodded. "I wasn't delirious," Catherine said. "I meant it. If something happens to me, if these men find us, promise me you'll get my sisters to safety. Promise me my baby will have a chance." Margaret started to protest, but Catherine cut her off with a look. "I promise," Samuel said, and meant it. Outside, the sun was shining for the first time in days. The world was white and pristine, beautiful in the way that mountain country can be after a storm. Samuel stood at the window, looking out at the unmarked snow. But he knew the unmarked snow wouldn't last. Tracks would appear soon enough. Men would come. They always did. He touched the pocket watch in his vest, his father's watch, engraved with words that had guided Samuel's life since he was a boy. Time reveals all truths. The truth was coming, riding through the mountains on horseback. The question was whether Samuel could protect these 4 women when it arrived, or whether he'd fail them the way he'd failed his own family 10 years ago. He turned from the window and began checking his rifles. Time to stop hiding, he thought. Time to remember who he used to be, whether he wanted to or not. The war had taught him how to fight. The mountains had taught him how to survive. Now, he'd need both skills, because Dalton Briggs and his men were coming, and when they arrived, there would be no more running. Only standing, only fighting, only the hope that this time, Samuel Frost could save the people who needed him. He loaded the Winchester, checked the action, set it by the door. Catherine watched him from the bed. "You don't have to do this. You don't owe us anything." "Maybe not," Samuel said. "But I gave you my word. That means something to me." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he needed this. Needed to prove he wasn't a coward who'd let the world burn while he hid in the mountains. Needed to know that the last 10 years hadn't been wasted, that he could still be the man he'd been before loss had broken him. The journal lay on the table between them, full of secrets and dangers. Samuel knew he should ride to Fortune's Ridge, confirm what Thomas had found. But he also knew he couldn't leave these women alone, not now, not with enemies closing in. So he'd wait, he'd watch. And when the men came because they would come, he'd be ready. Outside, somewhere in the vast white wilderness, horses were moving through the snow. Samuel couldn't see them yet, couldn't hear them, but he felt them coming the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. The real storm, he realized, hadn't been the blizzard that nearly killed these women. The real storm was just beginning. Fortune's Ridge rose out of the wilderness like a promise and a threat combined. Samuel reached it at dawn, approaching from the east where the terrain offered cover. The ridge itself was a massive granite formation, maybe 1,000 feet high, running north-south for several miles. Deep valleys cut between the cliffs, thick with pine and aspen. Beautiful country, the kind that made you understand why men had come west in the first place. He left Jasper tied in a sheltered grove and climbed on foot, moving quietly through the snow. His breath steamed in the cold air. The sun was just cresting the mountains, painting everything gold and pink. The survey markers were easy to find once you knew what to look for. Thomas Ward had been thorough brass stakes driven into the ground every 100 yards, each stamped with coordinates and dates. Samuel followed them north along the ridge, reading the terrain the way his father had taught him. The geology was promising, quartz veins visible in the exposed rock face, the kind of formation that could hold significant deposits. Thomas would have recognized it immediately. Samuel found the mine entrance in a narrow canyon, partially concealed by an overhang of rock. Someone had made an effort to hide it, branches stacked across the opening, snow piled to look natural. But the signs were there if you knew how to read them. Disturbed earth, chisel marks on stone, the faint smell of blasting powder. He cleared the entrance carefully, watching for tripwires or pitfalls. Thomas might have booby-trapped it, or Briggs's men might have, but there was nothing. just a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. Samuel lit the lantern he'd brought, stepped inside. The tunnel ran maybe 50 feet into the mountain before opening into a small chamber. Thomas's work was evident everywhere, support timbers properly placed, drainage channels cut to prevent flooding, geological samples carefully labeled and stacked along one wall, and the gold. Even in the dim lantern light, Samuel could see the veins running through the exposed rock, thick streaks of yellow metal, more gold than he'd ever seen in one place. Thomas's assessment had been conservative, if anything. This wasn't just a good strike. This was the kind of deposit that could make a person wealthy for generations. Samuel examined the samples Thomas had left behind, each one tagged with dates and locations, each one showing promising yields. Some pieces were nearly half gold by weight. At current prices, $16 an ounce, this mine could produce hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars over time. Catherine owned all of it. She just didn't know it yet. Samuel found more evidence of Thomas's work deeper in the chamber, a second set of documents sealed in a waterproof pouch, hidden under a loose rock. These were official claim forms, already filled out and dated, waiting only for Catherine's signature and registration at the territorial office. Thomas had been careful, methodical. He'd prepared everything his wife would need to claim her inheritance, had hidden it where only someone with the survey notes could find it. But he'd also left something else. Samuel almost missed it, a small journal, different from the one Catherine had. This one was personal, more diary than survey log. Thomas's private thoughts, written in the weeks before his death. Samuel sat on a rock, held the lantern close, and read. The entries were sparse but revealing. Thomas had known he was in danger, had suspected Briggs had learned about the strike, was planning something. Thomas had considered going to the authorities, but he didn't trust them. Too many officials in Briggs's pocket. Instead, he'd filed the claim under Catherine's name, hidden the documents, created a trail of breadcrumbs in his survey journal. If anything happened to him, Catherine would have everything she needed to claim the mine. She'd be wealthy, independent, safe. Except Thomas hadn't counted on Briggs being willing to hunt Catherine across half of Wyoming. Hadn't realized that without the survey notes, Briggs couldn't file a counterclaim. The journal wasn't just valuable, it was essential. The final entry was dated 2 days before Thomas's death. Tomorrow I meet with Briggs to deliver my final report. I'll tell him the survey found nothing of value. He'll suspect I'm lying, but without proof, he can do nothing. After that, I'll take Catherine and disappear. We'll use a different name, start over somewhere safe. The claim can wait, her safety cannot. Samuel closed the journal slowly. So Thomas had planned to run, had known the danger, tried to protect his family, but Briggs had moved first. Had killed Thomas before he could get away, then spent the next 6 months searching for the survey notes that would prove the claim was real. Samuel looked around the chamber, at the gold waiting to be extracted, at the documents that would make Catherine wealthy beyond imagination. All of it meant nothing if Briggs found her first. He was gathering the documents, preparing to leave, when he heard it, a sound from outside the mine. Horses, voices. Samuel extinguished the lantern instantly, pressed himself against the wall. Through the narrow entrance, he could see movement. 3 men on horseback, approaching the canyon. They hadn't seen him yet. Didn't know he was here. Samuel considered his options. He could hide in the mine, wait for them to pass, or he could try to slip out, get to Jasper before they spotted him. Either way carried risk. Then one of the men spoke, and Samuel's blood went cold. Check that mine entrance again. I swear I saw fresh tracks yesterday, but the snow covered them before I could be sure. You've been seeing tracks for 2 weeks, Henderson. Every shadow, every drift. We're chasing ghosts. The widow's out here somewhere. Briggs wants her found, wants that journal. We keep looking. Henderson. Samuel remembered that name from Catherine's story, one of Briggs's enforcers, the one who'd threatened Sarah. The men dismounted, started moving toward the mine entrance. Samuel had maybe 30 seconds before they'd see evidence of his presence: the disturbed snow, the opened entrance, the lantern he'd left just inside. He made his decision quickly. Couldn't fight 3 armed men in a confined space. Couldn't let them see him. Couldn't risk them reporting back to Briggs that someone was investigating the mine. Samuel moved deeper into the chamber, found a narrow crevice in the rock, squeezed himself inside just as the men entered the tunnel. "Someone's been here," Henderson said, his voice echoing. "Recent. Look at the entrance. Could be a prospector. These mountains are full of them. Or it could be the widow's friend, the mountain man Dutch mentioned." They had a lantern now, light spilling into the chamber. Samuel pressed himself deeper into the crevice, barely breathing. "Hell of a strike," one of the men whistled. "Look at that gold." Thomas Ward knew what he was doing. "Too bad he's dead," Henderson said without emotion. "Bring some samples. Briggs will want proof." Samuel watched them through a crack in the rock. Henderson was tall, lean, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, the kind of man who'd do anything for money. The other 2 were hired muscle, less intelligent, but just as dangerous. They gathered samples, examined Thomas's notes, talked about how much the mine might be worth. 20 minutes that felt like hours. Then, finally, they left. Samuel waited another hour after they'd gone, making absolutely certain. Then he emerged from the crevice, his muscles cramped and aching. He gathered what he needed: the claim forms, Thomas's personal journal, samples of the gold, left everything else as he'd found it. If Henderson came back, Samuel wanted him to think the mine was undisturbed. But now, Samuel knew 2 crucial things. First, Briggs's men were close, closer than Samuel had hoped. They were systematically searching the territory, checking every mine and claim. It was only a matter of time before they worked their way to Samuel's cabin. Second, they didn't know Catherine owned the claim. Henderson had talked about Thomas finding gold, about Briggs wanting the journal, but there'd been no mention of the claim forms, no indication they knew Catherine was the legal owner. That meant they were still looking for survey information, still planning to file their own claim, which meant Catherine's leverage remained intact. Samuel made his way back to Jasper, packed the documents carefully. He needed to get back to the cabin, needed to tell Catherine what he'd found, needed to prepare for what was coming. Because it was coming, sure as the winter snow. Briggs's men were converging on the Wind River range, tightening the net, and Samuel's cabin was right in the middle of their search pattern. He had maybe a week, 2 at most. After that, there would be no more hiding, no more running, just a reckoning between a ruthless mining baron and a mountain man who'd promised to protect 4 women. Samuel touched his father's watch, drew what comfort he could from it. Time reveals all truths. The truth was coming, riding hard from the south. The truth was about gold and greed, about justice and revenge, about whether one man with 3 rifles could hold off an army of hired killers. Samuel didn't know if he could win, but he knew he had to try. He mounted Jasper, turned north toward home. The mountains stretched before him, beautiful and brutal. Somewhere out there, Catherine and her sisters were waiting, trusting him to come back, trusting him to keep them safe. Samuel had failed that trust once before, with Ellen and Grace. This time, he told himself, this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't be too late. Samuel pushed hard on the return journey, covering in 2 days what should have taken 3. He arrived at the cabin just after dawn on the 4th day, exhausted but driven by a sense of urgency he couldn't quite name. The cabin looked peaceful. Smoke rose from the chimney. Fresh tracks in the snow showed Margaret had been checking the trapline, doing the work Samuel had shown her. Everything seemed normal. But something felt wrong. Samuel dismounted quietly, left Jasper tied at a distance, approached the cabin on foot, rifle ready. The tracks around the door were all Margaret's. He recognized her stride, her weight distribution. No sign of visitors, no indication of danger. Still, the feeling persisted. He knocked once, gave the signal he'd arranged with Margaret, 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The door opened immediately. Margaret stood there, the Winchester in her hands, finger off the trigger but ready. "Thank God," she breathed. "We were starting to worry." Inside, the cabin was warm. Catherine sat up in bed, colour returned to her cheeks. Sarah was cooking something that smelled like venison stew. Elizabeth sat by the fire, and for the first time since Samuel had found them, she looked at him without fear in her eyes. "You're back early," Catherine said. "We didn't expect you until tomorrow." Samuel set down his pack, accepted the coffee Sarah handed him. "Found what I needed. Figured I should get back." Over the next hour, he told them everything. About the trading post, about Dutch's warning of 7 or 8 men searching the territory, about Fortune's Ridge, the mine, the wealth of gold waiting there, about Henderson and his companions checking the mine just hours after Samuel had arrived. He saved the best part for last. Pulled out Thomas's personal journal, the claim forms, the samples of gold. Laid them on the table in front of Catherine. "Your husband filed this claim in your name," Samuel said gently. "That mine, everything in it belongs to you, legally, officially. All it needs is your signature and registration at the territorial office." Catherine stared at the documents like they might bite her. "I don't understand. Thomas never told me. Why would he?" "He was protecting you," Margaret said, reading over her sister's shoulder. "If the claim was in his name, Briggs could have killed him and filed a counterclaim, but in your name, using your maiden name, Briggs doesn't even know this claim exists. He's been looking for survey notes," Samuel explained. "Thinks Thomas found gold, but never filed. He wants the journal so he can file his own claim. He doesn't know he's already too late." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure relief. "So we're safe? Catherine owns the mine, and there's nothing Briggs can do?" Samuel hated to dampen their hope, but they needed to understand. "Not exactly. Briggs doesn't know about the claim yet. But once he finds out, he'll fight it through legal channels. He has lawyers, judges on his payroll. It'll be a battle." "But we have proof," Catherine said, touching the documents. "Thomas's survey, the claim forms, the samples. We do, which means we have leverage. We can negotiate, make demands, force Briggs to back off." Samuel paused. "Or we can disappear. Take these documents, register the claim under a false name, sell it quietly, and start over somewhere else." "Run away?" Elizabeth spoke up, surprising everyone. "Again? It would be safer," Samuel admitted. "No." Catherine's voice was firm. She removed her wedding ring, held it up to the light. 6 months she'd worn it, believing herself a widow. Now she knew Thomas had died, fighting for this mine, fighting for their future. "I'm done running. Thomas died for this claim. I won't dishonor his memory by giving it away." She handed the ring to Margaret. "Keep this safe. Whatever happens, I want you to have it. You've been more than a sister to me. You've been a mother when our own died. You deserve something of your own." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she took the ring. Samuel felt the weight of Catherine's decision settle over the room. No more running meant standing and fighting, meant facing Briggs head-on when his men finally arrived. "All right," he said. "Then we prepare. We have maybe a week before they find this place. We use that time to get ready." Over the next 3 days, Samuel turned the cabin into something resembling a fortress. He reinforced the doors, cut firing ports in the walls, stockpiled ammunition and supplies. Taught Margaret and Sarah, even reluctant Elizabeth, how to shoot, how to reload under pressure, how to stay calm when men were shooting back. Catherine watched from bed, her belly swelling with the baby that would arrive any day now. She made Samuel promise that if it came to a fight, if they were overrun, he'd get her sisters out. Save them, even if it meant leaving her behind. Samuel refused to make that promise. Instead, he showed them the root cellar, the hiding place he'd mentioned before leaving. It was cramped, dark, accessible only through a trapdoor hidden under the rug. All 4 women could fit if they squeezed together. If men searched the cabin, they might not find it. "This is your last resort," Samuel told them. "If I tell you to hide, you hide. No arguments, no hesitation. You stay hidden until I come for you, or until you hear my signal 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. Anyone else tries to open that door, you shoot through it." Margaret had changed over the past few days. The scared young woman who'd stumbled into Samuel's cabin was gone, replaced by someone harder, more determined. She practiced with the Winchester until her shoulder was bruised, until she could hit a target at 50 yards, even in wind. Sarah was softer, less naturally suited to violence, but she learned. She couldn't shoot as well as Margaret, but she was steady, calm, under pressure. Samuel suspected she'd been the one holding the family together emotionally while Margaret handled the physical dangers. Elizabeth remained an enigma. She could shoot that much surprised everyone, her hands steady, her aim true like she'd been taught before. But she never spoke about it, never explained where a 16-year-old girl had learned to handle firearms with such casual competence. On the 6th day after Samuel's return, Catherine went into labor. It started in the morning, gentle contractions that made her catch her breath, but nothing urgent. By afternoon, the pains were coming faster, harder. Sarah and Margaret attended her, drawing on memories of helping neighbors, of watching their mother give birth to Elizabeth years ago. Samuel stayed outside, ostensibly on watch, but really because a birthing room was no place for a man who wasn't family. He chopped wood, checked his rifles, tried not to think about Ellen giving birth to Grace, tried not to remember that he'd been away on patrol then too, had missed his daughter's entrance into the world. The labor lasted through the night. Samuel sat by the door, listening to Catherine's cries, to Margaret's soothing voice, to Sarah's whispered prayers. Inside that cabin, a new life was fighting to be born, while outside, men who dealt in death were closing in. The contradiction wasn't lost on Samuel. Life and death, hope and violence, all tangled together like roots of a tree. Just before dawn, a baby's cry split the silence. Samuel stood, hand on his rifle, until Margaret opened the door. She was exhausted, bloody, but smiling. "It's a girl. Catherine and the baby are both fine." Samuel allowed himself a moment of relief. Then he went back to watching the horizon, because somewhere out there, Henderson and his men were still coming. And now there were 5 women in the cabin instead of 4. 5 people Samuel had promised to protect. The odds kept getting worse. But then, Samuel had never been afraid of bad odds, just of failing the people who trusted him. He checked his rifle one more time, settled in to wait. Any day now, any hour, the men would come, and when they did, Samuel would be ready, or he'd die trying. They came on the 8th day. 3 riders approaching from the east, moving with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. Samuel spotted them when they were still a mile out, 3 dark shapes against the white snow. He'd been expecting an army. 3 men seemed almost insulting. Then he recognized Henderson, leading them, and his blood went cold. This wasn't an assault. This was reconnaissance. Henderson was smart enough to scout before attacking, to assess the situation before committing his full force. "Margaret," Samuel called softly. She appeared at the door instantly, Winchester ready. 3 men coming. Get your sisters into the cellar, now. What about Catherine? The baby? They go too. I don't care if you have to carry them. Move. Margaret disappeared inside. Samuel heard urgent whispers, the sound of the trap-door opening. Good. If this went wrong, they'd be hidden, safe. Samuel positioned himself behind the woodpile, rifle braced, watching the riders approach. They moved casually, no urgency, which meant they didn't know for certain anyone was here, just checking, like they'd checked 100 other cabins. They stopped 50 yards out. Henderson dismounted, raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hello, the cabin," he called out. His voice was cultured, educated, not what you'd expect from a hired gun. We're looking for someone. Maybe you can help us." Samuel said nothing. Sometimes silence was the best weapon. "We're searching for a woman," Henderson continued. "Pregnant, traveling with 3 sisters. Family matter. We just want to make sure she's safe. Bring her home." Still, Samuel stayed quiet. Let Henderson wonder if the cabin was occupied. Let him sweat. "Look, friend, we don't want any trouble. Just answer a few questions and we'll be on our way." Samuel considered his options. He could send them away with lies, but they'd be back. Could shoot them from ambush, but that was murder, not self-defense. Or he could face them, assess their intentions, try to end this peacefully. His father's watch felt heavy in his pocket. Time reveals all truths. Samuel stood up from behind the woodpile, rifle in hand but pointed down. "Cabin's occupied. No pregnant women here. Just me." Henderson studied him with cold intelligence. "You must be Samuel Frost. Dutch mentioned you. Mountain man, lives alone, minds his own business." "That's right. Then you won't mind if we take a look around, just to be sure." "I mind a lot, actually. This is private property. You're trespassing." Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We can make this easy or hard, Mr. Frost. Easy means you cooperate, answer some questions. Hard means he let the sentence hang." "Hard means what?" "You shoot an innocent man on his own land." "Hard means we come back with more men, search every inch of these mountains, and if we find you've been lying to us..." Again, that meaningful pause. Samuel had been in enough fights to know when one was inevitable. Henderson wasn't here for conversation. He was testing, probing, looking for weakness. In another few minutes, he'd try to force his way into the cabin, would discover the women, and then there'd be violence whether Samuel wanted it or not. Better to control when and how the violence started. Samuel raised his rifle. "You've got 3 seconds to mount up and ride out. After that, I start shooting." Henderson's hand moved toward his pistol. Samuel fired not at Henderson, but at the ground between the horses. The animals spooked, reared. The 2 men behind Henderson scrambled to control their mounts. "Next shot won't be a warning," Samuel said. Henderson's eyes went flat and dead. "Big mistake, Frost. You just made yourself an enemy of the Consolidated Mining Company. That's not a position you want to be in." "I'll take my chances." Henderson mounted his horse with deliberate care. "We'll be back, with enough men that your rifle won't matter. Think about that while you're waiting." They rode out, Henderson looking back once with a promise of violence in his eyes. Samuel watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he lowered the rifle, let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Margaret emerged from the cabin. "They'll be back." "I know. How many men does Briggs have?" 7 or 8, Dutch said. "Maybe more." Samuel looked at her. "This is your chance, Margaret. Take your sisters, ride for Fort Bridger tonight. I'll hold them here, buy you time to get away. And Catherine, she just gave birth 2 days ago. She can't ride. Then leave her with me. I'll keep her safe until she's strong enough to travel, then bring her to you." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You think Catherine would agree to that? You think any of us would leave her behind?" She was right. Samuel knew it, even as he made the offer. These women had proven they'd die for each other. They weren't going to abandon Catherine now. "Then we make our stand here," Samuel said. "Together." He spent the rest of that day preparing for siege. Set up firing positions, stockpiled ammunition at each one, filled every container with water, gathered enough firewood to last a week. If Briggs's men came, they'd find the cabin ready for war. That night, Catherine nursed her baby daughter. She'd named her Hope, while Samuel sat by the fire, cleaning his rifles for the 3rd time. Margaret was on watch at the window. Sarah was sleeping. Elizabeth sat in the corner, silent as always, but her eyes were alert, watchful. "Samuel," Catherine said softly, "can I show you something?" She reached under the bed, pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a journal, not Thomas's survey journal, but a different one, smaller, bound in black leather. "I found this in the root cellar," Catherine said. "When we were hiding, it was tucked in a crevice in the wall." Samuel took the journal, opened it to the first page. The handwriting was immediately familiar, the same precise script from Thomas's survey notes. But this journal was different, personal, and recent. The first entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Samuel's hands began to shake as he read. Margaret came to look over his shoulder. Sarah woke, joined them. Even Elizabeth crept closer, because the journal revealed a truth that changed everything. Thomas Ward wasn't dead. The body in the closed coffin, the one Catherine had buried 6 months ago, it had been another surveyor, a man who looked enough like Thomas that in death, damaged by the supposed cave-in, he could pass for Thomas Ward. Briggs had staged the whole thing, had killed the other surveyor, made it look like Thomas had died. But he'd kept Thomas alive, had been holding him prisoner for 6 months, forcing him to work on other surveys, to decode mining reports, to use his skills for Briggs's profit. Thomas had written this journal during his captivity, brief entries, written when guards weren't watching, recording his location, his treatment, the layout of the compound where he was held. He'd managed to smuggle it out through someone, a cook or stable hand, maybe with instructions to hide it where Catherine might find it if she ever came looking. The entries were heartbreaking. Thomas writing to a wife he thought he'd never see again, apologizing for the danger he'd put her in, begging her to save herself and forget about him. But he'd also left clues, descriptions of the compound, an old mining camp 40 miles northeast, up in the high country, guard rotations, weak points in the perimeter, everything someone would need to mount a rescue. The final entry was dated 3 days ago. "Tell Catherine I'm alive. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her to use the claim, save herself and our child. Don't come for me, it's too dangerous. But if someone does come, the guards change at dawn and midnight. The south wall has no watch. Cell 3, West Building. I'll be waiting." Samuel closed the journal, his mind racing. Thomas was alive, held captive 40 miles away, and he'd left a map for his rescue, hidden in the one place only Catherine would think to look, the cabin where her desperate flight had ended. "We have to get him," Catherine said. Her voice was steady despite the tears on her face. "We have to bring him home." "Catherine, you just gave birth," Margaret protested. "You can't. I'm not asking to come along. I'm asking Samuel to go, to bring my husband back." Samuel looked at the women around him. Catherine holding baby Hope, Margaret fierce and determined, Sarah gentle but brave, Elizabeth haunted but unbroken. 7 or 8 of Briggs's men were coming to this cabin, probably within the next few days. Henderson would bring his whole force, overwhelm Samuel through sheer numbers. But if Samuel left now, rode to Briggs's compound, he might be able to free Thomas. Might be able to end this not through desperate defense but through offensive action. It was a terrible plan. Insane, really. 1 man against a fortified compound. He'd probably die trying. But Thomas had left a roadmap, had given Samuel intelligence that made the impossible merely suicidal. And if Samuel could free Thomas, bring him back, they'd have leverage beyond just the claim forms. They'd have testimony about kidnapping, false death reports, imprisonment. They'd have enough to bring real law down on Briggs, the kind that even corrupt sheriffs couldn't ignore. "I'll need help," Samuel said finally. "1 person to come with me. Someone who can shoot, who can move quietly." "I'm coming," Margaret said immediately. "Margaret, no," Catherine started, but Margaret cut her off. "Sarah can protect you and Elizabeth. She's learned enough. And you need me, Samuel. You said it yourself, you need someone who can shoot." Samuel wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Margaret to stay safe, stay hidden. But he looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a scared young woman but a warrior. She'd been protecting her sisters for years, had learned to be hard when she needed to be. And he couldn't deny that 2 people had a better chance than 1. "We leave at dawn," Samuel said. Travel fast, hit the compound 2 nights from now, get Thomas out. Get back here before Henderson returns with reinforcements. And if Henderson comes while you're gone, Sarah asked quietly. You hide, Samuel said. You stay in that cellar no matter what. You don't come out until you hear my signal. And if 3 days pass with no word, Fort Bridger, Sarah finished. We know. Samuel retrieved his cavalry medal from a box under his bed. He'd earned it in a battle he'd rather forget, in a war that had stolen pieces of his soul. He'd kept it hidden, ashamed of what it represented. Now he pressed it into Catherine's hand. Keep this for me. I'm coming back. I'm bringing Thomas home. But if something goes wrong, if I don't make it, this proves I was military. It might help you get protection from the army. Catherine closed her fingers around the medal. Don't talk like that. You're coming back. Both of you. Samuel hoped she was right. But he'd been a soldier long enough to know that hope and reality rarely agreed. He touched his father's watch one last time. Time reveals all truths. The truth was that Thomas Ward was alive. The truth was that Samuel had a chance to do what he'd been unable to do 10 years ago, save someone before it was too late. The truth was that tomorrow he was riding into hell, and he might never ride back out. They left before sunrise, when the world was still painted in shades of grey and blue. Samuel rode Jasper. Margaret took the mare, a smaller horse but tough and reliable. They travelled light weapons, ammunition, 2 days of food, rope, and the supplies they'd need to bring back a man who'd been imprisoned for 6 months. Sarah and Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching them leave. Catherine held baby Hope, wrapped against the cold. No one spoke. What was there to say that hadn't already been said? Samuel had spent the night before teaching Sarah everything he knew about defending the cabin. Where to shoot from, how to reload quickly, what to do if men breached the door. She'd listened with the same gentle attention she gave to everything, absorbing it all despite the fear in her eyes. Elizabeth had surprised them all by speaking, just 3 words, directed at Margaret. Come back safe. Margaret had hugged her younger sister, whispered something Samuel couldn't hear. Then she'd picked up her rifle and declared herself ready. Now they rode northeast, following the coordinates from Thomas's journal. The terrain was brutal, steep climbs, narrow passes, snow that ranged from ankle-deep to chest-deep, depending on exposure. But Samuel knew these mountains, knew how to find the paths that elk and deer used, trails that followed the natural contours of the land. They didn't talk much that first day. Margaret was focused on riding, on keeping pace. Samuel was lost in his thoughts, planning the approach, considering contingencies. He'd done this kind of work in the war: infiltration, extraction, hitting targets behind enemy lines. But that was 20 years ago, when he was young and fearless and hadn't yet learned that violence always costs more than you expect to pay. They made camp that night in a sheltered grove, no fire to give away their position. Ate cold, jerky and hardtack, wrapped themselves in blankets against temperatures that dropped below 0. Tell me about the war, Margaret said into the darkness. Catherine said you were cavalry, that you've done this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He didn't like talking about the war, about the things he'd done, but Margaret deserved to know who she was riding with, what kind of man she was trusting with her life. I was a scout, he said finally. My job was to get behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, sometimes rescue prisoners or destroy supply lines. I was good at it. Too good, maybe. They kept sending me on harder missions, more dangerous ones. Is that where you learned to fight like you do? The way you handled Henderson? Some of it. The rest I learned after the war, when I was just trying to survive. Margaret shifted, pulled her blanket tighter. What happened? After the war, I mean. Why did you come out here alone? Samuel closed his eyes, saw Ellen's face, Grace's smile. I had a family, wife and daughter. I thought I could leave the violence behind, build a normal life. Then raiders came while I was on patrol. By the time I got back, he stopped, couldn't finish. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I tracked the men who did it, found them 3 days later. What I did to them, Samuel's voice went hard. The army gave me a medal. I threw it in a river because they didn't understand. It wasn't heroism. It was just revenge, and revenge doesn't bring anyone back. They were silent after that. But Samuel felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding. Margaret had lost her parents young, had spent years protecting her sisters from a world that didn't care about 3 orphaned girls. She understood loss, understood the weight of responsibility. "Why did you say yes?" Margaret asked eventually. "When Catherine asked you to help, you could have said no, could have sent us away." Samuel thought about that. "Because I failed to protect my family once. Maybe I'm trying to make up for it, or maybe I'm just tired of hiding from who I used to be. Who you used to be. Or who you still are." It was a good question. Samuel didn't have an answer. They reached the compound late the next afternoon. Samuel had them stop 2 miles out, leave the horses tied in a protected ravine. They approached on foot, moving slowly, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. The compound was exactly as Thomas had described it. An old mining operation converted to something more fortress than camp. Central buildings surrounded by smaller structures, barracks, storage sheds, what looked like a stable, wooden walls reinforced with stone. Guards patrolling the perimeter, rifles carried casually but ready. Samuel and Margaret watched from a ridge overlooking the compound, hidden among the rocks. Samuel counted men, 12 visible, probably more inside, dogs in pens near the main gate. The south wall that Thomas had mentioned, the one with no watch, was actually watched by 2 men. Either the security had been improved since Thomas wrote his journal, or he'd been wrong about that detail. 12 men, Margaret whispered. "How do we get past 12 men?" "We don't," Samuel said. "We go around them." He studied the compound layout, compared it to Thomas's descriptions. The west building, where prisoners were held, was the smallest structure, set slightly apart from the others. 3 small windows, heavily barred. 1 door, visible from the main courtyard. Getting to that building without being seen would be nearly impossible. Getting out again with a prisoner would be worse than impossible. Unless they created a distraction. "The stable," Samuel said, pointing. "See how it's downwind from everything else, and those fuel barrels stacked beside it?" Margaret followed his gaze, understanding dawning. "You want to burn it. Fire draws attention, gets everyone running in one direction while we go in another. Classic diversion. Won't they see us? See where we're going? Not if we time it right. Not if we move during the chaos." Samuel pointed to a gully that ran along the south side of the compound. "We wait until midnight, when the guards change. Thomas said that's the weakest moment. Old shift tired, new shift not yet alert. You start the fire. I go for Thomas. We meet at the gully. Run for the horses." "What about the dogs?" Samuel reached into his pack, pulled out a package wrapped in cloth. "Meat, laced with laudanum. We throw it to the dogs on the way in. They'll sleep for hours." Margaret looked at the compound, at the guards, at the impossible distance they'd have to cover. "This is insane. We're going to die." "Probably," Samuel agreed. She met his eyes, smiled without humor. "And miss all the fun? Not a chance." They waited through the afternoon and into evening, watching the compound's rhythms. Guards changed every 4 hours. Dogs were fed at dusk. Lights went out in the barracks at 9, stayed burning in the main building where Samuel assumed Briggs had his office. At 11, Samuel and Margaret moved down from the ridge, approached the compound from the south. The gully Thomas had mentioned provided cover, got them within 100 yards of the wall. Samuel checked his rifle one more time, made sure Margaret knew the plan. "Remember south wall, start the fire, get to the gully. If I'm not there in 10 minutes, you run. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving without Thomas." "Margaret." "No arguments. We go in together, we come out together." Samuel wanted to protest, wanted to order her to safety, but he saw his own stubbornness reflected in her eyes and knew it would be useless. "All right," he said, "together." They moved at midnight, when the compound was quiet and the guard change was happening. Threw the drugged meat to the dogs, watched them gobble it down and start to stagger. The guards on the wall were looking inward, watching the courtyard, not expecting threats from outside. Margaret reached the stable first, moving like a shadow. Samuel saw her strike a match, touch it to oil-soaked rags she'd stuffed against the fuel barrels. Then she was gone, running low and fast for the gully. The explosion came 30 seconds later. The fuel barrels went up like the hand of God reaching down, fire and smoke and noise, wood splintering, horses screaming. Men poured out of the barracks, running toward the flames. Samuel heard shouting, cursing, orders being barked. He used the confusion, ran across the courtyard to the west building. The door was locked but flimsy, one solid kick, and it splintered. Inside was dark, cells on either side, the stink of unwashed bodies and despair. "Thomas Ward," Samuel called softly. "Catherine sent me." A face appeared at one of the cell bars, thin, bearded, eyes that had seen too much suffering. But the intelligence was still there, the will to survive. "Cell 3, Thomas said, keys hanging by the door. Samuel found the keys, opened the cell. Thomas stumbled out, weak but mobile. 2 other men were in the cells, the surveyors Samuel had seen at the mine. He freed them too, figured they deserved a chance. "Can you run?" Samuel asked Thomas. "Watch me." They ran. Back across the courtyard, while men were still fighting the fire, too distracted to notice 4 figures moving in the smoke and shadows. A guard turned, saw them, opened his mouth to shout. Samuel fired once, dropped him. The shot was lost in the noise of the fire. Then they were in the gully, Margaret appearing from the darkness like she'd been conjured. The other 2 surveyors split off, running east. Samuel hoped they'd make it, but couldn't spare thought for them now. "Thomas?" Margaret breathed. "Margaret," Thomas said, wonder in his voice. "You're here. You're all here. Move now, talk later," Samuel ordered. They ran through the darkness, away from the burning compound, away from the shouting men. Behind them, someone was organizing a search party. Dogs were barking, the ones that hadn't eaten the drugged meat. They reached the horses. Samuel boosted Thomas onto the mare, took Margaret up behind him on Jasper. The horses were tired, but Samuel pushed them hard, racing through the night. Behind them, torches appeared on the ridge, voices calling out. But the darkness was their friend, and Samuel knew this terrain better than any of Briggs's men. They rode until dawn, until the horses were stumbling with exhaustion. Only then did Samuel allow them to stop, to rest, to breathe. Thomas looked at Samuel with tears in his eyes. "My wife, my baby, are they—" "Alive," Samuel said. "Safe. Catherine's waiting for you. You have a daughter now. She named her Hope." Thomas broke down then, sobbing with relief and joy and exhaustion. Margaret held him, her brother-in-law, the man they'd thought dead for 6 months. Samuel stood watch, rifle ready. They'd rescued Thomas, but they weren't safe yet. Briggs would come after them with everything he had, would chase them back to the cabin, would bring his full force down on Samuel's refuge. The real fight was still ahead. But for now, in this moment, they'd won. They'd taken something precious from Dalton Briggs, and Samuel felt a grim satisfaction in that. "Time reveals all truths," his father used to say. The truth was that Thomas Ward was alive. The truth was that Samuel Frost could still fight when it mattered. And the truth was that when they got back to the cabin, there would be a reckoning. Briggs would come, Henderson would come, and Samuel would be ready. He touched the empty space where his father's watch usually rested, remembered he'd given it to Catherine. It was all right. He didn't need the watch anymore. He knew what time it was. Time to finish this. Time to end it. Time to prove that some things, family, honor, promises, were worth fighting for. Time to go home. They came at dawn, just as Samuel had predicted. He spotted them when they were still half a mile out, 10 riders moving in formation along the ridge, Henderson in front, Briggs himself riding beside him. The mining baron had come personally to end this, to reclaim what he thought was his. "Everyone to positions," Samuel called softly. The cabin came alive. Margaret at the east window with the Winchester, Thomas at the south window despite his weakness, the Henry rifle steady in his hands. Sarah at the north window with the shotgun. Catherine, against everyone's protests, had positioned herself at a firing port in the west wall, a pistol in her lap. Elizabeth stayed in the center of the room with Hope, ready to hide in the cellar if the fighting breached the walls. Samuel took position at the door, his own rifle ready. "Remember what we talked about. Don't waste ammunition. Pick your shots, and know, heroes, we're trying to survive, not win medals." The riders stopped 300 yards out, just beyond accurate rifle range. Smart. They'd learned from Henderson's last encounter with Samuel. Now they'd probe, test, look for weakness before committing to an assault. Henderson rode forward alone, hands raised in a gesture of parley. He stopped at 100 yards. "Samuel Frost," he called out. "Mr. Briggs would like a word." "I can hear him from here," Samuel shouted back. Dalton Briggs rode up beside Henderson. He was a big man, prosperous-looking, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Samuel's entire cabin. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who saw people as assets or obstacles. "Mr. Frost, you've caused me considerable trouble," Briggs said. His voice carried easily across the snow. "You stole my property. I want it back. Thomas Ward is not your property. He's a free man you kidnapped and imprisoned." "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "We have Thomas. We have his testimony. We have enough to hang you, Briggs." Briggs laughed. "Hang me? I own half the territorial judges. You think anyone will believe a story about me holding prisoners, about me killing surveyors?" He gestured at the cabin. "Or will they believe that a mountain hermit and some desperate women concocted a lie to steal my mining claims?" Thomas shouted from inside. "The claim is legal, Briggs. Filed before you even knew the gold was there. The mine is Catherine's, not yours." Briggs's face hardened. "So you did file under the wife's name. Clever. But claims can be contested, Ward, especially when the original surveyor admits he falsified his reports. I'll never testify to that. You will, or your wife will, or her sisters will. I'll find whichever one of you breaks first." Samuel had heard enough. "You've said your piece, Briggs. Now ride out before someone gets hurt." "I have 10 men, Frost. You have what, 6 people? 2 women who just gave birth and got rescued from a prison? You can't win this." "Maybe not, but I can make it cost you more than it's worth." Briggs studied the cabin, calculating. Samuel could almost see him running the numbers. Then Briggs smiled, and Samuel's blood went cold. "You know what? You're right. A frontal assault would be expensive." Briggs turned his horse. "Henderson, burn them out." The riders fell back to 300 yards. 4 of them dismounted, started preparing torches. The plan was obvious: throw burning brands onto the roof, smoke them out, shoot them as they fled. Samuel's mind raced. The cabin was wood and stone, but the roof was vulnerable. Once it caught fire, they'd have maybe 10 minutes before the smoke became unbearable. "Margaret," he called. "Think you can hit a man at 300 yards? I can try. Wait for my signal." Samuel watched Briggs's men prepare their torches. Henderson was directing them, organizing the attack. The other 6 riders had spread out, creating a semicircle around the cabin's east side. They'd shoot anyone who ran from the fire. It was a good plan. Probably would work. Unless Samuel changed the equation. He'd been a cavalry scout, had done this kind of fighting before, had learned that sometimes the best defense was a sudden, shocking offense. "Thomas, you're in command," Samuel said. "I'm going out." "That's suicide," Thomas protested. It's a chance. If I can get to them while they're focused on the cabin, while they think I'm trapped inside. Samuel checked his rifle, his pistol. I can cut their numbers, maybe drive them off. And if they kill you, then you do what we planned. Hold the cabin, get word to Marshal Hart. Catherine appeared at the door, her face pale but determined. She pressed Samuel's father's watch into his hand. You come back for this. You promised. Samuel pocketed the watch. He slipped out the back window before anyone could argue further, hit the snow running, used the cabin as cover, circled wide to the north, where the terrain provided concealment. Behind him, he heard the first torch arc toward the cabin roof, heard it hit, heard the whoosh of flames catching. Margaret opened fire, her Winchester cracking in the cold air. Samuel didn't look back to see if she hit anyone. He was running hard, flanking wide, getting into position. Henderson's men were focused on the cabin, on throwing their torches, on watching for people fleeing the fire. They weren't watching their back. Samuel reached a position 30 yards behind their line, took careful aim at the nearest man. The old skills came back like they'd never left. The steady breath, the slight pressure on the trigger, the moment between heartbeats when everything becomes clear. He fired. The man dropped. Samuel was already moving, shifting position before return fire could find him. Fired again. Another man fell. Now they knew he was there. Bullets kicked up snow around him. He dove behind a boulder, returned fire, hit a third man in the leg. Chaos erupted. Briggs was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but they were caught between the cabin's defenders and Samuel's flanking fire. The neat siege had become a confused firefight. Samuel saw Henderson wheel his horse, saw the cold fury in the man's eyes. Henderson knew who disrupted the plan, knew Samuel was the key to everything. He spurred his horse forward, pistol drawn, coming straight at Samuel's position. Samuel aimed, fired, missed. Henderson was moving fast, weaving. Fired again, hit Henderson's horse. The animal screamed, went down hard. Henderson rolled clear, came up shooting. Bullets whined off the rocks beside Samuel's head. Samuel tried to fire back, but his rifle was empty. He drew his pistol, but Henderson was faster. The bullet caught Samuel in the shoulder, spun him around. He fell, hit the snow hard. Pain exploded through his body. Henderson stood over him, pistol aimed at Samuel's head. Should have stayed out of it, old man. Then a rifle shot cracked out. Henderson jerked, looked down at the red stain spreading across his chest. He turned, saw Margaret standing 50 yards away, Winchester smoking. Henderson tried to raise his pistol, but his strength was failing. He collapsed beside Samuel, dying in the snow. From the cabin, more shots. Thomas and Sarah were firing now, driving back the remaining men. Briggs was shouting, trying to rally them, but his force was broken. 4 men down, the rest scattered. Samuel struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, saw Briggs making a decision, saw him turn his horse and ride. The remaining men followed. 6 men had come to burn the cabin. Now 3 were riding away, leaving their dead behind. Margaret reached Samuel, supported him. "You're hit." "I noticed," Samuel grunted. They made it back to the cabin together. The roof was burning, but not badly. Thomas and Catherine had doused the worst of it with snow. The fire would die on its own. Inside, Thomas embraced Samuel despite the wound. "You magnificent fool. You saved us." "We saved each other," Samuel corrected. Catherine was crying, whether from relief or stress or joy. Sarah was checking Samuel's wound, declaring it serious but survivable. Elizabeth held hope, who'd somehow slept through the entire battle. Margaret stood at the window, watching the riders disappear over the ridge. "They'll be back." "No," Thomas said with certainty. Briggs broke. His men saw it. He abandoned the fight, ran from 6 people in a cabin. "Word will spread. He's finished." Samuel hoped Thomas was right, but even if Briggs came back, even if they had to fight again, something had changed. They'd won. Not just the battle, but something deeper. They'd stood together, fought together, survived together. They'd become more than survivors. They'd become family. And family, Samuel was learning, was worth any cost. Spring came to the mountains like a promise kept. 3 weeks after the battle, Samuel sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the snow melt into rushing streams. His shoulder was healing well, thanks to Catherine's patient care. The wound had been clean, the bullet passing through without hitting bone. He'd been lucky. Again, Marshal Clayton Hart had arrived 2 weeks after the fight, riding in with 4 deputies and enough authority to make even corrupt sheriffs nervous. Thomas's testimony, combined with the evidence from the compound, had been enough to issue warrants for Dalton Briggs and his remaining men. Briggs had tried to run, but Hart was patient and thorough. They'd found him in Denver, arrested him at a hotel. He was awaiting trial now, facing charges that would likely put him away for the rest of his life. The mine at Fortune's Ridge was officially registered in Catherine's name. The claim was ironclad, verified by territorial surveyors. Thomas had estimated it would produce $20,000 a year for at least a decade, maybe longer, more money than any of them had ever imagined. But that wasn't what made Samuel smile as he sat watching the sunrise. Thomas emerged from the cabin, carrying baby Hope. The surveyor had gained weight, lost the haunted look that had marked him when Samuel had freed him from that cell. He looked like a man again, not a ghost. "Beautiful morning," Thomas said, settling beside Samuel. "It is. Catherine wants to talk to you. About the mine, about what comes next." Samuel had been expecting this conversation. They'd been living in his cabin for almost 2 months now. 7 people in a space meant for one. It was time to make decisions about the future. Inside, Catherine was making breakfast with Margaret's help. Sarah was teaching Elizabeth a song, their voices blending sweetly. The cabin that had been empty and silent for 10 years was now full of life and noise, and the kind of chaos that comes with family. "Samuel," Catherine said, turning from the stove, "we need to discuss arrangements." He knew what was coming. They'd be leaving soon, building their own place near the mine, starting the life that Thomas had died trying to give them. And Samuel would return to his solitude, to the silence he'd chosen. Except the thought didn't bring the peace it once had. The thought of this cabin empty again felt wrong somehow. "Before you say anything," Catherine continued, "I want you to know something. Thomas and I have talked about this a lot, about what we owe you, about what you've given us. You don't owe me anything. We owe you everything," Thomas corrected. "You saved Catherine and her sisters from freezing to death. You decoded my survey notes. You rode into a fortified compound to rescue me. You fought off Briggs's men. Without you, we'd all be dead. I did what anyone would do." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You did what a good man would do, what a brave man would do, what family would do." The word hung in the air. Family. "We want you to come with us," Catherine said. "When we build our home near the mine, we want you there. Not as a hired hand, not as protection, as family. The mine belongs to all of us, Samuel. You're listed as co-owner on the deed," Thomas insisted, and I agreed. Samuel started to protest, but Catherine held up her hand. "You gave me your father's watch. You told me it was all you had left of your family. But here's the thing, you have a new family now. Us, all of us. And we're not letting you hide in these mountains anymore." Sarah came forward, shy but determined. "You taught me to be brave. Let us teach you that it's okay to not be alone." Elizabeth, speaking more freely now, added, "You showed me not all men are monsters. Let us show you not all families end in loss." Margaret simply said, "Stay." Samuel looked at them, Thomas and Catherine, Margaret and Sarah, and Elizabeth, baby Hope, sleeping in her father's arms. 7 people who'd stumbled into his life in a blizzard, who'd trusted him when they had no reason to, who'd fought beside him when the odds were impossible. His father's watch was in his pocket, warm against his leg. Time reveals all truths. The truth was that he'd spent 10 years punishing himself for failing to save Ellen and Grace. 10 years hiding from life because he'd lost the life he'd had. But life didn't wait. Life kept moving, kept offering chances, kept putting people in your path who needed you, and who, it turned out, you needed just as much. "All right," Samuel heard himself say. "I'll come." Catherine's smile could have lit the cabin by itself. Margaret hugged him, careful of his wounded shoulder. Sarah and Elizabeth joined in. Thomas shook his hand, man to man, brother to brother. "There's one condition," Samuel added. "We do this right. We build a home big enough for all of us. We work the mine fair and honest. And we remember what it cost to get here. Remember Thomas's sacrifice. Remember the fight. Remember that family is worth defending." "Agreed," Thomas said. They spent the rest of that morning planning where to build, how to develop the mine responsibly, what kind of life they wanted to create. It was the kind of boring, wonderful, ordinary conversation that families have. The kind of talk about the future that only makes sense when you have people to share that future with. Later, Samuel walked to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge where he'd first seen 4 women huddled against death in the snow 2 months ago. A lifetime ago. He pulled out his father's watch, opened it. The inscription caught the light. "Time reveals all truths." His father had been right. Time had revealed that Samuel wasn't meant to die alone in these mountains, had revealed that sometimes the coldest nights do bring the warmest hearts together, had revealed that family isn't just blood, it's choice and sacrifice and standing together when the world tries to break you apart. Below, smoke rose from his cabin. Inside, 7 people were building a future together. 7 people who'd chosen each other, who'd fought for each other, who'd become something stronger than the sum of their parts. Samuel closed the watch, smiled. He'd come to these mountains to hide from life. Instead, life had found him anyway, had walked right up to his door in the middle of a blizzard and refused to leave. He was glad it had. He walked back down to the cabin, to the noise and warmth and chaos of family. Behind him, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent. But Samuel wasn't part of the mountains anymore. He was part of something better, something worth fighting for, something worth living for. He was home, and this time he was never leaving again.